Well, we titled our book Forbidden Archaeology because we found out that over the past 150 years, archaeologists have literally buried almost as much evidence as they've dug up, and they tend to like to keep that evidence suppressed because it goes against current views. That's why we call the book Forbidden Archaeology, because we catalog that missing evidence. Well, I began my involvement in the book in 1984 when Richard Thompson gave me the assignment of putting some of the information that he had gathered up to that time in book form. And as I got more involved in doing that, I saw that more research had to be done in different areas, so we conducted more research. We got more and more leads, and it took about 8 years to put the entire book together. Well, I had no previous background in this field, and I think this is one of the important points to recognize, is that sometimes you need a second opinion. You need an outside person to come in and dig around. You can't always trust the experts in a particular field to give you a complete picture of the truth. So many professionals may not like that. Many professional archaeologists may not like the idea that you have an outside person come in and look at what they're doing, but sometimes I think that's necessary. I think we're talking about a massive cover-up. As I said, over the past 150 years, these archaeologists and anthropologists have really covered up as much evidence as they've dug up, literally. And we call it a knowledge filter, a process of knowledge filtration, whereby evidence that goes against the accepted theories tends to be screened out, and you don't hear about it. It's as if you could consider archaeology, archaeological science, as a big museum. Now, when you go into that museum, they show you some rooms where there are certain pieces of evidence, but what they don't show you is the many more locked rooms where there are pieces of evidence that go completely against the idea that human beings like ourselves are a fairly recent occurrence on this planet. So what Richard Thompson and I did in Forbidden Archaeology was take people on a guided tour of those locked rooms and let them in on the secrets. Well, we called our book Forbidden Archaeology because we wanted to take people on a tour of the locked rooms in the museums of human history. Because it's a fact, Richard Thompson and I found out in over 8 years of investigation that archaeologists and anthropologists have literally buried almost as much evidence as they've dug up. And we want people to be aware of that. Let them see what's there. Archaeologists and anthropologists tend to bury evidence that conflicts with their preconceived ideas about human origins and antiquity. According to most standard accounts, human beings like ourselves have only been around 100,000 years or so. But the evidence that we catalog in Forbidden Archaeology takes human history back tens of millions, even hundreds of millions of years. I'll give you one very good example. In the 1840s, an anatomically modern human skeleton was found 90 feet deep in coal in Illinois. And this was reported in a scientific journal called The Geologist. Now, we got in touch with the Geological Survey of Illinois, and they told us that the coal in the place where this skeleton was found would be over 280 million years old. Now, this is just one case, and in our book we catalog hundreds. Now, I'll tell you what this means. According to modern views, human beings like ourselves have only been around on this planet for 100,000 years or so, and before that you would have had only ape-man-like creatures. So to have an anatomically modern human skeleton appearing 280 million years ago means only one thing, that current ideas about human origins and antiquity are completely wrong. The kind of thing we're talking about isn't taught in schools because the educational system is now under the control of the people who maintain this orthodox view. I'll tell you what kind of reactions we're getting from experts on this book. Now, people in mainstream anthropology and archaeology are screaming at this book. Now, that shows that they're taking it seriously, because if they could, they would ignore it. They're finding they can't ignore it. Too many people are taking it seriously. Therefore, they're trying to put it down. Richard Leakey, for example, wrote me a letter saying it's pure humbug. In the American Journal of Physical Anthropology, a review came out calling it dreck. But on the other hand, we're finding many independent-minded scholars, people who are professionally involved in geology and anthropology and other sciences, are saying that this is a great book. One geologist said it is bound to become an underground classic because it contains so much information that should be of interest to professionals in these fields. Now, an important thing to realize is that we haven't found just one or two examples. We found hundreds of examples of what we call anomalous evidence, evidence that doesn't fit the current theories. Now, this indicates something. This indicates that a process of knowledge filtration is going on. This evidence is being systematically suppressed, ignored, and forgotten for no good reason. What we would desire as a result of the research that we've done is simply this, that archaeologists and anthropologists take a look at this evidence and evaluate it in an even-handed manner. Now, that will be very difficult for them because they are completely fixed on this idea of a fairly recent origin for the human species. So this would be a very difficult proposition for them. But we believe if they looked at it without applying a double standard, which is what they tend to do, evidence that goes along with their theories, they tend to let pass without much scrutiny. Anything that goes against the theory tends to be subjected to unfair criticism. But we would say, just take a look at the evidence, evaluate it in an even-handed, objective way, and let's see where the facts lead us. Although much of the evidence that we record in the book was originally discovered in the 19th century, such things are still being discovered even today. And I'll give you a very good example. In the 1970s, Mary Leakey, the wife of Louis Leakey, who was one of the greatest anthropologists of the century, found at a place called Laetoli in Kenya a set of modern human footprints in volcanic ash that was dated to be 3 million years old. Now, this is quite extraordinary because, according to standard views, human beings like ourselves are only about 100,000 years old. So to find these footprints, which are no different than the footprints you would find on a beach today in ash that's 3 million years old, is quite extraordinary. Unfortunately, the mindset of the scientists who looked at these prints was such that they could not reach the obvious conclusion that the beings who made these footprints, which are exactly like ours, must have been very much like us. The only thing that they could say is that whoever was around at that time, whatever type of ape man was around at that time, must have had very human-like feet, which is something that's not borne out by the fossil evidence, because the bones, the foot bones they have of the ape men, the Australopithecines they're called, who lived at that time, do not match those prints. To support the current paradigm on human evolution, there's very little evidence. Now, it was Richard Leakey who said that the bones, the fossil bones that support this idea could be put on a few large tables. So we're not talking about very much evidence. Now, when you put all the other evidence on the table, and it would take many, many tables to put this evidence upon, the modern idea completely falls apart. The experts seem to have a lot of confidence that they've got the story of human origins all figured out. At least that's the image they project to the public. But behind the scenes, there's a lot of controversy going on. Actually, they have very little evidence, only a few fragments. Richard Leakey once said it's only enough to put on a couple of pool tables. And the interpretations of this evidence are very contradictory. I'll give you an example. Lucy, the famous Australopithecine, discovered by Donald Johanson. He says she was very human-like, but I was at a conference of anthropologists where many of them were making a case that she was hardly distinguishable from an ape or a monkey. Maybe she spent most of her time hanging around in trees rather than walking on the ground like us. If this opposing view of Lucy is true, it means we have to throw the whole theory of human evolution as it now stands out the window. Now, according to modern accounts, they have a bias, a preconception that we are very recent and that we have evolved from more ape-like creatures. And this idea is so fixed in many people's minds that it poses a barrier to their acceptance of evidence that contradicts that view. And as Richard Thompson and I show in our book, Forbidden Archaeology, there are huge mountains of evidence showing that anatomically modern human beings, like ourselves, have been on this planet for 10 million, 20 million, 30 million, even hundreds of millions of years. I'll tell you what all this means. It means that we have to radically rethink our concepts of human origins and human destiny. People, right from the beginning of Darwin's evolutionary ideas, they weren't concerned about how the butterflies came about, how the cockroaches came about. What they were interested in is where we came from and where we're going. So the evidence in our book showing that we have been around a lot longer than most people think means that we have to really rethink who we are and where we're going. Now, many people will ask, well, why don't we find evidence of humans in the same strata that we find the bones of the dinosaurs? But what Richard Thompson and I show in our book is there are pieces of evidence like that that do show that human beings existed during the so-called age of the dinosaurs. Now, admittedly, there's not a lot of evidence like that, but there is some, and it really bears serious examination. In fact, we've even documented cases of evidence for human existence before the age of the dinosaurs as well. I'll give you a good example of that. In South Africa, near a place called Klerksdorp, people have found perfectly round metallic spheres in Precambrian strata, over 2.8 billion years old. And some of these have parallel grooves, 3 parallel grooves around their equators. It's hard to see how those could have been made by anything other than an intelligent being. When Darwin published The Origin of Species, scientists all over the world began looking for evidence for the missing link. Now, what today's history books don't tell you is they found not evidence for the missing link that they were looking for, but they instead were finding all kinds of stone tools, anatomically modern human skeletons that place the origin of our species, or the presence of our species, back tens of millions of years. And that's very amazing. You won't find these reports in the current textbooks because they go against the ideas of human evolution that later developed. Now, many people will ask, well, if we're going to give up, the modern ideas about human origins, then where to next? And I'd like to suggest that we might take some inspiration from the great cultures of the world, because every culture of the world has something to say about where humans have come from. Now, I draw a lot of personal inspiration from the Vedas, which are the Sanskrit text of India, and among them are books called Puranas, or histories. And these Puranas say that human civilizations have been on this planet for tens of millions of years. But it's also very interesting, although these books were written thousands of years before Darwin, they also talk about ape men. Now, it isn't that one came from the other, but they both coexisted over these vast periods of time. And you can make a prediction. If you predicted from those Puranas what you would find if you looked in the earth for stones and bones and things like that, you would find pretty much what we catalog in our book, Forbidden Archaeology. Now, some people will ask, is there any other evidence for this idea that human beings have been on this planet for hundreds of millions of years? There's lots of archaeological evidence for it, but it's also very interesting that if you examine the great cultures of the world, the Egyptians, the Chinese, the Japanese, and especially the Indians of Asia, their histories tell the exact same story, that human beings had been on this planet for a long, long, long time. Now, most of the evidence that we catalog in Forbidden Archaeology was originally reported by scientists and scientific journals, and that's what makes it so compelling. But there's another category of evidence, and this is evidence reported by more ordinary individuals. And it is really quite mysterious, but nevertheless, I think it's deserving of attention. Now, I'll give you an example. In the 1890s, a woman named Mrs. Culp found in a block of coal a 10-inch piece of gold chain. Now, when she broke this lump of coal open, the chain connected the two parts, so it was firmly embedded in the coal. And this was reported in a newspaper, the Morrisonville Times. Now, we checked with the Geological Survey of Illinois. We found out that the coal from the mine that particular piece came from is from the Carboniferous, which means that gold chain would be over 280 million years old. We found out from relatives of this woman that they confirmed the story. Now, the chain was lost because after she died, it was passed on to a relative and nobody's been able to find it. But still, it's a quite interesting story. This is not just a hoax story that was made up, because investigators later checked with her relatives, and they do remember her finding that chain, and they remember it being passed on to relatives. Now, what's really amazing is that this coal was over 280 million years old. Now, what will modern archaeologists say about this? They won't say anything, because it is completely beyond the bounds of their expectations.
We called the book Forbidden Archaeology because it is dealing with a whole area in the science of archaeology that is basically off limits to mainstream science. So in that sense, it's forbidden. Well, what we find in science in general is that not all evidence is acceptable. Science judges evidence on the basis of theory. And evidence that tends to be in line with a particular theory will be acceptable for study. It can go a little bit outside of the bounds of the accepted theory and still be acceptable, although controversial. But there are other categories of evidence which will be completely outside of the bounds of a given theoretical perspective. And that evidence generally is rejected by the scientific community. I started this project back in about 1983. And I've been involved extensively in the research. I've written some parts of the book, and I've been extensively involved in discussing each step of the argument that is presented in the book. Basically, the archaeological digging that we were doing took place in libraries. We dug down through stratified layers of reports that you find in old journals and books and so forth in libraries to find an earlier stratum containing much information that has been essentially buried, lost to sight by present-day scientists. We found actually that if you go back to the late years of the 19th century and early decades of the 20th century, that there were elaborately developed schools of scientific thought in the field of archaeology, specifically the study of ancient man, which contain much information that is simply not accessible today. The material that we uncovered presents a completely different perspective on human antiquity than what you have in the present mainstream archaeology. Basically, the perspective that people were holding at in the late 19th century and early 20th century is that the human race may go back into what they call the tertiary period of geological history, which means, in terms of today's dating, a period of from 2 to up to 50 million years ago. The evidence that we've been collecting in this book can be basically divided into two categories. One is evidence which at one time was studied by professional scientists and reported in journals and discussed in conferences by scientists. This evidence tends to indicate that human beings, like ourselves, have been living on this earth back perhaps 50 million years or 55 million years. There's another category of evidence which has not been so acceptable to scientists at any point in the course of scientific history. This is evidence that is more popular in nature. This would indicate an even greater age for the presence of human beings on the earth, going back even hundreds of millions of years. Basically what you find is something we call a knowledge filter. This is a fundamental feature of science. It's also a fundamental feature of human nature. People tend to filter out things that don't fit, that don't make sense in terms of their paradigm or their way of thinking. So in science, you find that evidence that doesn't fit the accepted paradigm tends to be eliminated. It's not taught, it's not discussed, and people who are educated in scientific teachings generally don't even learn about it. It's not necessarily a deliberate conspiracy in the sense of some people getting together in a smoke-filled room and saying, we're going to deceive people. It's something that happens automatically within the scientific community. Science operates as a social system, and basically acceptability of evidence is based on the social interaction of different scientists. So when a given piece of evidence disagrees with the predominant theory, then automatically people won't talk about it, they won't report it, and it just won't be entered into their scientific way of thinking. It's an automatic process. Well, the end result is that you don't have a clear picture of reality. You only see what the theory allows you to see. And that's very good if, in fact, the theory is already a good description of reality. But if there are features of reality that your theory doesn't describe, then you miss those features. And that means that science fails to progress in the way that one would hope. Well, what you find today is the predominant accepted theory in modern anthropology and archaeology is that the human race only goes back about 2 million years to the point of origin in some form of transitional ape man. Modern day humans, Homo sapiens sapiens, go back at most about 100,000 years. So this is the time span within which the archaeologists are working. So the evidence we've uncovered takes you back many millions of years for anatomically modern man. So it gives you a completely different perspective on the antiquity of the human race. One basic preconception that people have based on the Darwinian evolutionary theory is that you have a progressive development from more primitive stages to more advanced stages. And this leads people to think that if you go way back in the past, what you find should be primitive, and if you go even further back, you shouldn't find something more advanced, because things should be more primitive. But in fact, that's not necessarily true. And in fact, the evidence we've uncovered indicates that you have the coexistence of primitive forms, so-called primitive forms, meaning more ape-like creatures, and advanced human beings as far back as you go in the past.
So it's not unusual for them to coexist.
It's certainly not impossible for the so-called primitive or ape-like creatures to coexist with modern humans. After all, even today you have chimpanzees and gorillas and so on, and you have human beings. So likewise, if you go, say, 2 million years into the past and you find remains of an ape-like creature, it doesn't necessarily follow that everything was more primitive back then. It's perfectly possible you could have modern-type humans also living at that time. The basic body of evidence that we've uncovered in this book suggests that human beings of modern anatomical type have been existing for many, many millions of years into the past. And in particular, they were existing before the time of, for example, the Australopithecus, the ape man, which is being presently touted as a human ancestor. The idea that the Australopithecus, for example Lucy, is a human ancestor is really based on the misconception that something that is old and ape-like must be a previous stage in human evolution. But that's not necessarily true. And the evidence that we've uncovered indicates that, in fact, human beings of modern type were existing at the same time as the Australopithecus, and in fact even at earlier times going back millions and millions of years. Well, there are different categories of evidence that we have uncovered. One, of course, very striking category of evidence would be human skeletal remains. There are some very well-attested cases in which you have skeletal remains of modern human type which would be millions of years old, specifically dating, for example, to the Pliocene period, which would be from 2 to 3 million years ago. The method of research we used for forbidden archaeology was basically to dig in the libraries by a process of tracing back footnotes through layer after layer of scientific books and papers. And we would find that the suppressed evidence at the uppermost level or layer would be referred to perhaps by a single footnote, which very dismissively, in a few brief words, said that that evidence was nonsense. And so you trace that back to its source and you find a more elaborate dismissal. Then you trace that back further to its source and you may find an entire book which is dedicated to debunking that particular body of evidence. But then when you go to the next layer beneath that, you may find many different books and papers that give a very positive account of the evidence and mention many different details which are not discussed in the later books and papers. So in this way we worked our way back and made many interesting discoveries. Yeah, I could briefly recount one interesting story that we uncovered. I won't go into all the details, of course, but this illustrates how anomalous scientific evidence can be received by the scientific community. It's the story of a discovery of a bola stone. A bola stone is a stone with a groove cut in it. A leather thong is tied to that, and it's used for throwing to capture animals. So this bola stone was found embedded in the surface of a cliff in South America. The rock of that cliff dated to about 2 to 3 million years ago. So the man who made the discovery knew that there would be skepticism if he announced something like this. So he left the stone in place, just barely showing on the surface of the cliff, and he got several prominent experts in geology and archaeology to gather there. And in front of these experts, he then chipped the stone out of the cliff. The experts verified that the stone of that cliff really would be what's called Pliocene, dating to 2 to 3 million years ago. And they saw him chip it out. They saw that it was actually embedded in the rock. And they saw that it was actually a man-made object. So what do you think then was the result? Did people then accept scientifically that man must have existed 2 to 3 million years ago in South America? No, not at all. One of the authorities who was there wrote in his report that, well, it may be that somehow he hoaxed the find. He may have dug a hole in the cliff and prepared a cement that looked just like the rock, cemented the bola stone in place, and fooled us all. So in this way, the evidence then was dismissed. Well, basically, the reason that he would give an explanation like that is that the presence of humans in South America 2 to 3 million years ago would go completely against the accepted framework for the ancient history of the human race. And so a scientist would then naturally think, well, there must be some other explanation. What could it be? We know that people sometimes create hoaxes. What is better, to assume that this man created a hoax or to throw out our whole theory? So it's natural then that he would come up with that explanation. Well, this is the knowledge filter in action. You can see how it's working. Actually, that scientist's position wasn't so unreasonable, especially from the point of view of his scientific colleagues who accepted his explanation. But then what becomes of evidence for a high antiquity of the human race if each individual piece of evidence is dismissed in this way, no matter how strong the evidence may be? What you'll see is that all the evidence is gone from sight, and one is only left with the prevailing picture. And one thinks, well, that has been scientifically established. Well, it's a common misconception that scientists back in the late 1800s or early 1900s would be somehow less professional, less knowledgeable than modern-day scientists. But that's not actually true in this field. It might be true in a field like physics, perhaps, although that's debatable too. But in the field of archaeology, you will find that the scientists who were operating, let us say, in the late 19th century were just as meticulous, as rational, as professional as the scientists in those fields today. Some of the terminology has changed. Scientists will use different words to refer to different concepts today than they did back in the late 19th century. But as far as their attention to detail and their careful checking of all alternative explanations and so forth, they're really comparable. An example would be the Laetoli footprints, for example, discovered in Kenya by Mary Leakey. These footprints are anatomically the same as those of modern human beings. And so the question is, what sort of being made them? The mainstream viewpoint would be that ape-like creatures with very human feet made the footprints. But if you look at the foot bones discovered for these very creatures, you'll find that they won't fit into the footprints. So there you have an anomaly. You have modern-looking footprints about 3 million years ago. So who made them? The ape-like creatures, the Australopithecines, couldn't have made them. Some popular presentations that you will see give the impression that evolution from ape to man goes in a straight line, and we have all the steps in that linear sequence, and so everything is perfectly crystal clear. It's not like that at all. And prominent evolutionists will openly admit this. For example, Stephen Jay Gould, very prominent evolutionist, has said that evolution is not like a ladder or a straight line. It's like a bush. Now imagine a bush with many little branches. How many samples would you have to find to trace out the links between those different branches? If you take a number of different samples at different points in a bush, you'll see that they don't link together. So how do you know that there are links at all? How do you know that you're actually sampling a connected evolutionary tree? Now, in contrast, if you take many samples or even a small number of samples from a linear progression, then you can easily see that that goes in a straight line. So if Stephen Jay Gould is right, then having a few samples here and there will not enable you to show that evolution has in fact taken place. It's just a matter of interpretation. You find a few fossil bones, some more primitive than others. You say that the ones that are more primitive are older and that they must be ancestors of the ones that are less primitive. Even so, this process doesn't work. The scientists today in the fields of anthropology and archaeology are completely in disagreement with one another as to how to evaluate these different fossil finds and make a coherent picture of human evolution. They're unable to put the pieces together at the present time. In the evidence that we've covered in our book, mainly there are two categories of evidence. The principal category of evidence takes us back about to a maximum of 55 million years. This is the evidence which has been studied in the past by professional scientists and written up in papers and books and so forth. This, of course, doesn't say anything directly about the dinosaurs. Now, there's another category of evidence which is reported in popular sources, such as newspapers, personal testimony by witnesses, and so forth. Although scientists have not touched this evidence because it's too far out, still it comes up frequently enough that we felt that it should be taken seriously and investigated. Because here you have a case where the knowledge filter is working with particularly high intensity. And yet even though that's the case, many examples of this evidence do show up. So we have cases of human artifacts found, for example, in coal deposits dating back to the Carboniferous period, about 250 million years back. Many different accounts of this kind are there. And so there's some indication that intelligent beings who could make such artifacts were in fact living on the Earth even 250 million years ago. We have not specifically addressed the topic of man living with dinosaurs. That's another whole subject. In our files we have some evidence along those lines, but we haven't fully evaluated that yet, nor have we tried to really bring the dinosaurs into the picture. We do have some evidence that indicates that human beings were living at the time of the dinosaurs or earlier than the time of the dinosaurs. As I was mentioning, one main category of highly anomalous evidence would be that of artifacts that are found in coal deposits. Typically the coal deposits date to the Carboniferous period before reptiles even came into being, according to the standard scenario of evolution. So you have such things as gold chains found in coal, iron pots, stones with faces sculpted on them, and various items like that, which are in some cases found by miners, in other cases found by people using the coal in their home, breaking open the lump and finding something embedded in it, and so forth. So this evidence does exist. The Paluxy River case is very controversial. It's a very complex case, and I think one would have to make intense study to really understand what is going on there. I've read a number of conflicting reports concerning the nature of the so-called man tracks or human tracks that are found alongside dinosaur footprints. Mainstream scientists acknowledge that dinosaur footprints are found in the Paluxy riverbed. The question is, do certain tracks that look human come from human beings, or does it come from another kind of dinosaur that left human-looking tracks? Was it a dinosaur whose toes somehow weren't showing up so you didn't see the big claw marks? There's a lot of controversy about that. It would be interesting to investigate. The photo of the Meister footprint, that's a very interesting case. I personally investigated Meister's discovery. I went to his home near Salt Lake City, Utah, and I saw the actual footprint. It's a single footprint. Unfortunately, we don't have a series of prints forming a track. That would be very nice to have. But this single footprint is shaped precisely like the print of a shoe. You see the front part of the sole, you see the heel. The heel is worn on the side, as often happens in a shoe print. In every way, it followed the shape and size of a human shoe. So I examined this with a magnifying glass, and it looked quite authentic. Now, I can't say that that proves that it was made by a human shoe, but in every way it looked like that. If it was a freak of nature due to splitting of the rock due to heat or something like that, you'd think that, well, it might look like a shoe print part way around, but then it should deviate and give you some irregular shape. But it was a perfect print. Now, the interesting thing here is that the substance of the rock beneath the print had apparently been compressed also. So some pressure was there, which you would also associate with a footprint. And the shell of a trilobite could be seen in the print, flattened in the middle of it, which is an indication that it must be at least 400 million years old, because the trilobites became extinct after about 400 million years ago. So that was an interesting case. Well, the Meister footprint is interesting. I inspected it myself. I visited Mr. Meister in his home. The print is shaped like a sandal print or shoe print. And in the middle of it, you'll see the shell of a trilobite, which is squashed there. That gives you an indication of the age, because trilobites supposedly became extinct about 400 million years ago. In fact, Meister found this in a Cambrian formation, which takes it back about 600 million years. Scientists who've investigated this case agree that the print is that old. However, they don't think that it's made by a shoe. They think it's a natural splitting of the rock called a spall. But the shape is exactly like that of a human shoe print, both in terms of dimension and the particular way it curves. So in particular, the heel is in the right proportion to the rest of the foot. The heel is worn on one side, as would happen with a shoe naturally. So it's a very interesting case. Now, having seen all those things, you can't say, well, it's proven that that is a shoe print. There's no way you can say that. But it certainly looks like one. Cryptozoology is a field of study mainly founded by a French scientist named Bernard Heuvelmans, which is the search for unknown animals. Crypto means hidden, and zoology is the study of animals. So basically, Heuvelmans was interested in studying large animals, mammals, reptiles, and so forth, which are unknown to science. And he's found that there are many different reports indicating the existence of such animals.
Can you give us an example?
Well, there are many examples. The example of an unknown type of animal that is most relevant to our book would be the famous Bigfoot. Bigfoot is said to be an erect walking ape-like creature. This is highly relevant to the human evolution question, because the Australopithecus is also said to be an erect walking ape-like creature. So if today you have erect walking apes, but science doesn't know anything about it, then that's a very interesting state of affairs. If science cannot even tell us about what is living on the earth today, then how can it explain to us what was happening millions of years ago? So this evidence of cryptozoology is quite relevant to our study. In cryptozoology, there's some evidence relating to the possible existence of dinosaur-like creatures that may be living today. You notice I said possible and maybe and so forth. There are reports from Africa of very large creatures that might be like dinosaurs. So this is a field of study. I don't believe the results that have been obtained thus far are completely definitive. There are extensive amounts of evidence concerning what are traditionally called sea monsters, which would be some kind of large serpentine or reptile-like creature living in the ocean. There's a very extensive body of evidence indicating that such creatures probably exist. I've seen the photo of the plesiosaurus picked up by the Japanese trawler. I'm not sure if that's what it really was. It was in a highly decayed condition, and it may be that it just seemed to have that shape. It may have been remains of some other sort of animal, so I'm not really sure about that one. If you look into the scientific literature, you'll find many examples of what are called anomalies. Anomalies are facts that just don't fit, which don't even make sense. Some of them don't even make sense from an ordinary common sense point of view. So one example would be the case of toads found in solid rock, especially geologically very ancient rock that would supposedly date back millions of years. There are persistent reports of such things. And I was showing you a photograph of a case where a toad was found in a mummified state inside a flint geode. There are other cases where people have reported repeatedly from many different parts of the world that they split open a stone and a live toad was found in it. So it's very hard to understand how that could be. But anomalies of that kind do exist. This bone is a cast of the thigh bone of the so-called Java man, or Pithecanthropus, which is very famous in archaeological history. A scientist named Eugene Dubois found this in Java in the late 19th century. And he also found a skull cap, the top piece of a skull, that looked very primitive and ape-like. This bone was found maybe 40 feet away from the skull in a deposit along the side of a river. And Dubois proposed that the bone, the thigh bone, and the skull belonged to the same creature. So this would be the bone of an erect walking creature, like a human being. And the skull was very ape-like. So he said, aha, we have found the ape man, a human ancestor, a missing link. That was the story. Very interesting thing, though, has happened. In recent years, scientists have learned more about this ape man that they call Pithecanthropus. They have found that his thigh bone was quite different from a human thigh bone, whereas this one is almost identical to a human thigh bone. So the indication is that a human being and the creature with the ape-like skull were living together, maybe about 1 million years ago in Java. In fact, the owner of the ape-like skull may have been a gigantic gibbon or ape of some kind, and the owner of the thigh bone may have been a human like us. Another important point to make about the Java man find is that more recent studies of this ape man, you see the Pithecanthropus ape man is accepted to exist. It's called Homo erectus. So more recent studies have shown that the thigh bone of Homo erectus is very different from a human thigh bone in measurable ways. This is almost identical to a human thigh bone. So this then could not belong to Homo erectus. So the indication is that in fact somebody with an ape-like skull was living in the same area as someone with a human-like thigh. So maybe you had a big ape and a human being living together in Java about 1 million years ago. So the important point to make about the Java man discovery is that, first of all, it's based on a speculative leap in which two pieces of evidence are put together in a way that's not really warranted. This speculation was accepted for many years. Recently there was the Ancestors exhibit in New York in the Museum of Natural History. This same thigh bone plus the skull cap was exhibited there and labeled as a human ancestor. So you see the persistence of this idea. So it was based on flimsy speculation. It persisted in the science of archaeology for many, many years. Even today, it is still there. And because of it, much other evidence that was quite strong was thrown out. Well, you see, what happens is that evidence that supports the ruling paradigm, even if it is flimsy, is acceptable. But evidence that goes against the ruling paradigm, even if it's very strong evidence, is nonetheless rejected. This is what you find. So you'll find evidence that is not of good quality remaining in the textbooks, and other evidence that's of much superior quality is excluded from the textbooks, and you never get to learn about it.
This is a knowledge filter?
This is the knowledge filter in action. The Castandidolo find was made in the 1880s in northern Italy, a place called Castandidolo. The discovery was made by a geologist named Ragazzoni. He was aware that in the case of human skeletal remains, you may be dealing with what is called an intrusive burial. That is, someone may have dug a grave, and that's how the bones got down there. So he very carefully examined the strata above the skeleton to see that they were undisturbed. Because if you dig a grave and take the earth out and then dump it back in, it will mix up the strata. Furthermore, he observed that the bones were scattered horizontally over a number of feet. And this does not fit in with the idea that someone dug a shaft and placed the body there. These were anatomically modern bones, and the strata would date to the Pliocene period, being about 2 to 3 million years ago. Now, what happened with this find was that it was rejected by the scientific establishment. First of all, it simply was greeted with a lot of skepticism. Then, another find that Ragazzoni made was discredited on the basis of some reasonably good reasons. But then, by association, this find became discredited. Then, in fairly recent years, a carbon-14 date was run on the skeleton after the bones had been sitting in a museum for many years. And it was found that the skeleton dated back only 1,000 years. It was a medieval burial, so they said. So now you have a case of which set of evidence is more weighty. The carbon-14 date made on bones that have been sitting in a museum for years, having an opportunity to become contaminated, or the original very careful study showing the situation of the bones within the earth. So our argument is that you at least have to give comparable weight to these two pieces of evidence. Therefore, you shouldn't throw out the Castandidolo find. It should be seriously considered. But the standard point of view has been, well, it's only 1,000 years old. That settles it, and we didn't believe it anyway. So therefore, again, you see the knowledge filter at work. Evidence that goes against the accepted theory doesn't get the same kind of fair trial as evidence that goes with the accepted theory. There's a common conception that a carbon date is almost like the word of God, that it must be absolutely true. But there are many ways in which carbon dates can be erroneous. For example, if modern carbon enters into the specimen through, for example, the growth of mold or fungus, and in various other ways, then the date will be thrown off. It will be too young. So many different types of contamination can take place. And there's a whole literature on this in the subject of carbon-14 dating. One phenomenon that you do see in archaeology is the technique of rejecting something by running different dating tests until you find a date that enables you to rule out that piece of evidence. Then you rule it out. In some cases, one date may not rule it out, so then you take another date until you find one that gives you what you want. Procedures of this kind do go on, and in our book we have some analysis of some cases of this kind of thing. Well, briefly, the Castandidolo case is important evidence for the existence of human beings in the Pliocene period, at a time when northern Italy was an ocean, about 2 to 3 million years ago. So the evidence deserves to be taken seriously. We don't want to dogmatically say, well, this is proof and you have to accept this. But our point is that the evidence should not be buried. And the evidence in favor of the antiquity of the Castanedolo find should not be regarded as simply wrong, whereas the carbon-14 date of 1,000 years must be accepted as absolutely right. They should be weighed, and their relative weight should be assessed in some rational way. To do that weighing, the evidence has to be there on the table. If the evidence is suppressed and unknown, then it's not possible for people to arrive at a proper judgment. Well, of course, the evolutionary theory, as it exists today, says that human beings have evolved gradually, and that if you go as far back as 100,000 years, you come to the beginning of the human race as we know it today. Prior to that, you had only more primitive forms of human or semi-human being. According to the Vedic literature, human beings of the type we have today have been existing for many millions of years. And furthermore, higher types of human beings have also existed, which are unknown to modern human experience. In ancient times, according to the Vedic accounts, you had a wide spectrum of degrees of culture in human society. At one end, you would have highly advanced people with a very highly developed civilization. At the other end of the scale, you would have what you might call aborigines, people in a primitive state of civilization. So according to the Vedic literature, these different cultural levels have coexisted on the earth in different proportions over very long periods of time, amounting to millions of years. The basic idea of what is commonly called creationism is that the forms of different living beings were created by God, by divine intelligence. That can be contrasted with the evolution theory, which says that these forms came about without any foreknowledge of the result. They came about simply by physical processes, by the atoms interacting with one another in nature, without intelligent control. Those are the two conflicting points of view. The Vedic literature also comes down on the side of the creationists with regard to the origin of the different forms of life. The creationists maintain that the different forms of life were divinely created. Vedic literature also says the same thing. Now, the details of how that happened may be different. The Christian creationists refer to Genesis in the Bible, and there's not much information beyond that in the Judeo-Christian tradition. The Vedic literature gives a very detailed account of the creation of different life forms, and it carries it back through a number of different stages. So it's a very elaborate account. The mainstream academic community has largely reacted negatively to the book. Certainly the representatives of mainstream archaeology and anthropology have given us a negative reaction, and this is what we expected. They could hardly do otherwise, given the position that they're committed to uphold scientifically. There are some individual scientists in the fields of archaeology and anthropology who have made positive comments. Some have made the very good point that even though we may not agree with the conclusions in this book, the data that is being presented here is of great value. And it's very useful for all this data to be gathered together in one place so that we can take a look at it, because otherwise no one would have access to this information. So I think that's a very good point. There are other scientists who have commended us for giving a very thorough and impartial analysis of this data. And I think that's important also, that we're not just dogmatically taking a certain rigid view that this must be accepted, but our basic point of view is that one should look at all of the evidence and then be able to make a reasonable decision. The main outcome that we would like to see from our publication of Forbidden Archaeology is that we would like to see an opening up of our serious scientific inquiries into the nature and origin of human beings and also other forms of life. We feel that the mainstream scientific position on these questions has been too narrowly constricted for a very long period of time. Much important evidence has been left out of the picture, and many important ideas have also been excluded. We would like to see a much deeper investigation into all of the available evidence. And in this way we could learn more about what we are and what our real purpose in life should be.